It has been over 10 years of marriage, and it is still like this. On a cold Thanksgiving evening in an old Boston estate, the family sat for dinner while Hannah stood before the table, her hands trembling as she held a heavy, steaming pot of gravy, her apron still thick with the scent of grease. At that moment, her father-in-law, sitting at the head of the table, slammed his silverware down and muttered a single cutting sentence. Those few words made Hannah's fingertips shake, and the very air in the room turned to ice. As her eyes slowly scanned the faces at the table, the heavy silver pot in her hands began to tilt. What exactly is about to happen at this holiday dinner? A wounded dog once crawled through thorns to save its master, but what happened next in this kitchen broke everyone's heart. Welcome to our channel. Before we begin this emotional journey, please like and subscribe, and let us know in the comments where you are listening from so we can send our warmest thoughts to you. Now let us begin today's story. The wind off the Charles River carried a biting chill, whispering through the fog-laden streets of Boston like the ghosts of a grander era. Outside the tall, narrow windows of the Winthrop estate, the gas lamp-style streetlights flickered against a gray, heavy sky that promised snow before midnight. Inside, the air was thick, not with the warmth of a holiday, but with the suffocating scent of roasting fat and the heavy dampness of an old house that had forgotten how to breathe. This was Thanksgiving, a day for gratitude. Yet the atmosphere within these brick walls felt more like a slow-moving trial. Hannah stood at the center of the kitchen, her silhouette framed by a swirling haze of grease and steam. She was a woman whose beauty had become quiet and weary. Her hair, once a vibrant chestnut, was pulled back in a practical, frayed knot, and her eyes held the depth of a calm sea just before a storm. Her hands, red and chapped from hours of scrubbing and prep work, trembled slightly as she basted the massive turkey that seemed to mock her with its weight. Behind her, the kitchen door creaked open. Arthur entered, leaning heavily on a mahogany cane. He was the patriarch of a crumbling kingdom, a man with silver hair and a sharp, hawk-like nose who dressed in tweed vests that had seen better decades. He carried the arrogance of the New England aristocracy in his marrow. Even though the family fortune had long since bled dry through failed ventures and extravagant pride, to Arthur the world was still a place where the Winthrop name commanded a bow, and Hannah was merely the steward of his fading glory. He didn't look at her. He looked at the stove. He dipped a sterling silver spoon, tarnished at the edges, into the gravy boat and tasted it. His face contorted as if he had swallowed vinegar. "It's salt, Hannah," Arthur said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that cut through the sound of the bubbling pots. "A Winthrop table does not serve brine. My grandmother used to say that a woman's character is found in her seasoning. If this is the state of your character, it's no wonder the sauce is ruined. It's clumsy, amateur." Hannah didn't respond immediately. She stared at her hands. Her knuckles were cracked, a map of her decade of service to this house. Her mind drifted back to a different time, to the 5 years she had spent waiting for Henry. She remembered the letters they exchanged when they were young, filled with poetic promises of a life built on mutual respect. Henry had been her hero then, a man who promised to rescue her from the mundane and build a world of starlight and shared dreams. But the 5 years of romantic waiting had led to 10 years of this. Henry was in the other room, a shadow of the man he once was, hiding behind architectural sketches of buildings that would never be built, avoiding the friction between his wife and his father. He was a man of soft edges and quiet retreats, handsome but fading, like a photograph left too long in the sun. Hannah looked around the kitchen. The wallpaper was peeling in the corners, revealing the skeletal laths of the house. This estate was a shell, a monument to a nobility that no longer existed, fueled only by Arthur's hollow boasts and Hannah's literal blood and sweat. She had spent 10 years trying to salt the earth of this family to make something grow, and all she received was the sting of it in her wounds. Arthur paced the small space, his cane thumping rhythmically against the linoleum. "The guest will be here in an hour. My siblings expect the standard we have maintained for generations. If you cannot handle a simple bird, perhaps you should have stayed in the countryside. We took you in, Hannah. We gave you a name that meant something. The least you can do is not embarrass it with your incompetence." Hannah felt a heat rising in her chest that had nothing to do with the oven. It was a searing, ancient coal of resentment that had finally caught flame. She looked at the gravy, then at the heavy silver platter, the Winthrop heirloom, resting on the counter. It was supposed to hold the turkey, a centerpiece of a lie. She thought of a story she had heard as a child, of a dog that had been beaten and cast aside, yet crawled through miles of thorns to pull its master from a fire. Even a wounded dog is moved by a sense of loyalty and love. But what happens when the master is the one lighting the fire? She turned to face Arthur, her voice steady but vibrating with a frequency that made the glassware on the shelves hum. "You speak of character, Arthur? You speak of salt?" She picked up the heavy silver platter. It felt cold and dead in her hands. "A wounded dog crawled to save its master because it knew the meaning of a home," she said, her voice rising like the wind outside. "Even a beast knows when a soul is worth saving. But I have stood in this smoke for 10 years. I have mended your roof, I have bathed your wife, and I have seasoned your pride with my own life. And yet, you treat my devotion like a stain on your floor." Arthur froze, his eyes widening in shock. "How dare you? Why is my sacrifice treated with such contempt?" Hannah interrupted, her eyes blazing with a mythological fury. "If a dog deserves a crumb of mercy for its loyalty, what do I deserve for my life?" With a sudden, violent grace, she let her grip loosen. The heavy silver platter crashed to the floor. The sound was deafening, a dry metallic shriek that echoed through the hollow house, shattering the suffocating silence of the evening. The platter didn't break, but it dented the floor, and the vibration seemed to shake the very foundation of the room. The fake piece of the Winthrop Thanksgiving was gone. The grease, the smoke, and the grease-stained apron were no longer her shackles. They were her armor. Arthur stood speechless, staring at the dented silver at his feet, as Hannah took off her apron and laid it over the ruined gravy. The ring of the silver platter against the floor became the new frequency of the Winthrop house. In the days that followed that disastrous Thanksgiving, a heavy, suffocating silence settled over the estate, thicker than the Boston fog. Arthur had retreated into a cold, judgmental shell, speaking only to demand his tea or to complain about the draft. Henry, meanwhile, had perfected the art of becoming a ghost. He spent his hours in the attic studio, surrounded by vellum paper and charcoal dust, drafting grand libraries and coastal villas that no one had commissioned. His neutral stance was not a bridge, it was a wall. For Hannah, the explosion in the kitchen had changed everything and nothing at all. The domestic machine still required her blood as fuel. The leak in the servants' wing, a vestige of the 1920s that Arthur refused to acknowledge as a sign of decay, had worsened with the first December sleet. While Arthur sat by the fireplace nursing his pride, Hannah was the one climbing the creaking ladder into the crawl space, her fingers numb as she applied temporary sealant to the rotting beams. The burden extended beyond the architecture. Eleanor, Arthur's wife and Hannah's mother-in-law, had become a permanent fixture of the upstairs bedroom. Eleanor was a delicate woman, once a socialite of high standing, now reduced to a frail shadow, with skin like translucent parchment and eyes that often wandered to a past only she could see. She was not unkind, but her dependency was absolute. Hannah was her nurse, her confidant, and her legs. Every morning, Hannah would carry a tray of poached eggs and dry toast up the narrow stairs. She would help Eleanor wash, her own back aching as she supported the older woman's weight. "The girls called yesterday, didn't they?" Eleanor whispered one morning, her voice thin as a reed. "They sent cards, Eleanor," Hannah replied softly, adjusting the pillows. The girls were Henry's sisters, Beatrice and Clara. Beatrice was a high-powered gallery owner in Manhattan, and Clara was married to a hedge fund manager in the Hamptons. They were women of exquisite taste and zero utility. To them, the Boston house was a museum to be visited once a year, and Hannah was the curator they forgot to pay. Their contributions to their mother's care consisted of expensive scented candles and Hallmark cards with pre-printed messages about the warmth of family. They never asked if Hannah needed help. They only asked if the silver was polished for the next potential appraisal. Seeking a moment of air, Hannah stepped out onto the back porch to shake the dust from the hallway rugs. Across the low stone wall that separated their property from the next sat Martha. Martha was a woman in her late 70s, a retired librarian with iron gray hair kept in a sensible bob, and eyes that saw through the pretensions of the neighborhood. She was usually found pruning her rose bushes or, as she was today, sipping bitter tea from a cracked ceramic mug. "That house is eating you, Hannah," Martha said without preamble, her voice crisp and devoid of pity. "I see you on that roof. I see you hauling the trash. I see that husband of yours looking at the clouds while you're looking at the dirt." Hannah stopped shaking the rug, her shoulders sagging. "It's just a difficult season, Martha. The house is old." "It's not the house that's the problem," Martha countered. "Houses can be fixed. It's the ghosts inside. You're becoming one of them. Every day you stay in there, you lose a bit more of your color. You're translucent, girl. I can almost see the brickwork through your skin." "I made a promise," Hannah whispered, her eyes fixed on the gray horizon. "To who? The man Henry used to be, or the man he's pretending not to be now?" Martha stood up, her movements stiff but purposeful. "Don't wait until you're as brittle as Eleanor before you decide to break." Hannah went back inside, Martha's words ringing in her ears. She found Henry in the hallway, dressed in a wool sweater, his eyes glued to his smartphone. He was laughing, a genuine, light-hearted sound that felt like a slap in the face. "That was Julian," Henry said, still smiling at the screen. "He's thinking of opening a firm in San Francisco. He wants me to consult on the aesthetic. Can you believe it? My old roommate, finally making a move." Hannah looked at him, then at the pile of heavy oak logs sitting by the mudroom door. The firewood had been delivered that morning, dumped in a heap that blocked the path. The temperature was dropping, and the wood-burning stove in the kitchen, the only reliable source of heat in the drafty back half of the house, was running low. "Henry, I need help with the wood," Hannah said. Her voice was flat, exhausted. "The bags are heavy, and the sleet is starting to turn to ice. If we don't get them inside now, they'll be too wet to burn." Henry didn't look up. His thumbs were flying across the screen, typing a response to his friend. "Just a second, Han. Julian is sending the blueprints over now. This could be a huge opportunity for me. A real project, you know? Not just these sketches." "The project right now is the house, Henry," she said, her voice rising slightly. "I've been on the roof twice this week. I've carried every tray up to your mother. My back is failing me. Please, just 5 minutes." "I said in a second," Henry snapped, his irritation finally breaking through his neutral mask. "God, Hannah, can't you let me have one moment of professional connection? I'm busy. Call the neighbor's kid or something. I'm on an important call." He turned his back to her, walking toward the stairs, already pressing the phone to his ear as Julian called back. "Hey, yeah, I saw the files. Listen, the brutalist influence on the facade is interesting, but—" Hannah stood in the cold hallway, listening to the muffled sound of her husband's voice discussing the facade of a building thousands of miles away, while his own home crumbled around them. She looked at her hands, red, raw, and trembling. She walked to the mudroom, opened the door, and stepped out into the freezing wind. She didn't call the neighbor's kid. She gripped the first heavy bag of wood, the rough plastic biting into her palms. As she hauled the weight toward the door, a realization crystallized in the bitter air, sharper than any icicle. She wasn't just tired, she was alone. She had been married for 10 years, but she was living a life of solitary confinement. Henry wasn't her partner. He was just another weight she had been trained to carry. As the sleet began to sting her face, Hannah stopped fighting the cold. She let it in, letting it freeze the last of her hesitation. The frost on the windows of the Winthrop estate didn't just crawl, it claimed. By mid-December, the glass was etched with intricate, jagged patterns that seemed to mirror the hardening heart of the woman inside. The silence between Hannah and Henry had evolved from a tense standoff into a vast, glacial expanse. They navigated the house like two ships passing in a fog, aware of each other's presence only by the occasional creak of a floorboard or the muffled sound of a closing door. Henry continued his retreat into his digital world, chasing the phantom of a career he had never truly built, leaving Hannah to manage the decaying reality of their existence. The evening began with a sky the color of a fresh bruise. A nor'easter was howling down from Canada, threatening to bury Boston under a shroud of white silence. Inside, the heating system, a temperamental beast of iron pipes and hissing steam, had finally surrendered to the cold. Hannah had spent the afternoon moving space heaters into Eleanor's room, trying to create a pocket of warmth against the encroaching freeze. Henry had left hours ago, mentioning something about a crucial networking event at a high-end lounge downtown. He had dressed with more care than he had shown in years, polishing his shoes until they shone like mirrors. While Hannah stood in the kitchen, her hands stained with the soot of a stove she was trying to coax back to life. "You look nice," she had said, her voice devoid of inflection. "It's important, Han," he replied, checking his reflection one last time. "People need to see that the Winthrops are still in the game. Influence isn't just about money, it's about presence." He hadn't asked if she needed anything. He hadn't noticed the way she winced when she moved, her back still protesting from the wood hauling of the week before. He simply vanished into the swirling snow, leaving the scent of expensive cologne to linger in the hallway like a cruel joke. By 10 o'clock, the wind was a physical force, rattling the ancient window frames until they groaned. Hannah was in the parlor, sewing a torn hem on one of Eleanor's nightgowns, when she heard it, a thin, ragged sound from upstairs. It wasn't a call, it was a struggle. She raced up the stairs, her heart hammering against her ribs. In the dim light of the bedroom, Eleanor was propped up against her pillows, her face a terrifying shade of ash. Her chest was heaving, but no air seemed to be reaching her lungs. Each breath was a desperate, whistling rasp, the unmistakable sound of a severe asthma attack triggered by the biting cold and the dust of a house that was falling apart. "Eleanor," Hannah breathed, kneeling by the bed. She fumbled for the inhaler on the nightstand, but Eleanor pushed it away, her eyes wide with panic. It was empty. Hannah reached for the bedside phone. Dead. The storm had claimed the lines. She grabbed her cell phone from her pocket. No signal. The thick stone walls of the estate and the atmospheric interference had turned the house into a tomb. "I've got you," Hannah whispered, though her own hands were shaking. "I've got you, Eleanor. We have to go. Now." She didn't have time to wait for a miracle. She didn't have time to wait for a husband who was likely clinking glasses in a heated room miles away. Hannah wrapped Eleanor in a heavy wool cloak and a down comforter, creating a cocoon against the elements. Then, drawing on a reserve of strength she didn't know she possessed, she lifted her mother-in-law. Eleanor was frail, but in the grip of a crisis, she felt like lead. Hannah's muscles screamed, her spine complaining with every step, but she carried the older Funu down the stairs, through the freezing hallway, and out into the teeth of the gale. The world outside was a white abyss. The snow was already knee-deep, swirling in blinding eddies that stung Hannah's eyes. She stumbled toward the old SUV parked in the driveway, her boots slipping on the hidden ice beneath the drifts. The wind tried to knock her over, but she leaned into it, a human shield for the gasping woman in her arms. As she struggled to get Eleanor into the passenger seat, a memory flashed unbidden into her mind. A sunny afternoon in Providence 10 years ago. It was their wedding day. The air had been sweet with the scent of salt and blooming lilacs. Henry had stood before her, looking at her with eyes that promised protection. "I will be your solid wall," he had vowed, his voice thick with emotion. "Nothing will ever hurt you as long as I am standing." The irony was a bitter pill. Now Hannah was the wall. She was the one standing between this family and the abyss, while the man who had made the promise was nowhere to be found. No one was standing for her. The drive to the hospital was a nightmare of blurred lights and skidding tires. The roads hadn't been plowed, and the SUV fishtailed through the drifts like a wounded animal. Hannah drove with one hand on the wheel and the other gripping Eleanor's hand, murmuring encouragement even as her own terror threatened to overwhelm her. "Stay with me, Eleanor. Just a little further. Breathe for me." When they finally skidded into the emergency bay of the hospital, Hannah fell out of the car, screaming for help. Medics swarmed them, lifting Eleanor onto a gurney. Hannah followed them inside, her coat encrusted with ice, her hair a wild tangle, her body trembling with a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. Hours later, in the sterile, fluorescent quiet of the waiting room, a doctor approached her. He was a young man, Dr. Eris Thorne, with weary eyes and a gentle demeanor that suggested he had seen the best and worst of humanity in equal measure. "Are you the daughter?" he asked, checking his chart. "The daughter-in-law," Hannah replied, her voice sounding foreign to her ears. Dr. Thorne smiled, a genuine expression of admiration. "Well, you saved her life." 10 minutes more and her lungs would have given out completely. That was a heroic effort, getting her through a storm like this. You were her guardian angel tonight. At that moment, the automatic doors slid open and Arthur entered. He was dressed in his heavy overcoat, his silver hair perfectly coiffed despite the wind. He walked with a stiff, practiced dignity, his cane clicking on the linoleum. Behind him trailed Henry, looking disheveled and sheepish, his polished shoes now ruined by salt and slush. "How is she?" Arthur demanded, ignoring Hannah entirely and addressing the doctor. "She's stable," Dr. Thorne said, his tone shifting to something more professional. "But as I was telling your daughter-in-law, she's only here because of her quick thinking and incredible strength. This woman saved her life tonight." Henry stepped forward, his face a mask of guilt. "Han, I'm so sorry. My phone died, and the roads were—" Arthur cut him off with a sharp wave of his hand. He looked at the doctor, then turned his cold, gray gaze toward Hannah. He took in her disheveled appearance, the melted snow dripping from her coat, the raw, red skin of her hands. There was no gratitude in his eyes, only a stubborn, ancient pride that refused to acknowledge a debt. "It was her duty," Arthur said, his voice a dry, chilling rasp. "She is a Winthrop by marriage. Taking care of the family is simply the obligation she took on. There is nothing heroic about fulfilling one's basic responsibilities." The air in the hallway seemed to vibrate. Henry looked at the floor, unable to meet Hannah's eyes. The doctor's jaw tightened, his admiration turning to silent disgust. For 10 years, Hannah had looked away. She had swallowed the insults, accepted the crumbs of affection, and convinced herself that her silence was a form of strength. But as she stood in the fluorescent light, her body aching and her spirit raw, something snapped. The solid wall she had built around her heart finally cracked, and through the fissure, a new cold clarity emerged. She didn't look at the doctor. She didn't look at her husband. She looked directly into Arthur's eyes, her gaze level and unyielding. For the first time in a decade, she didn't blink. She didn't look down. She stood in her own truth, a silent, mythic figure forged in the fire of the storm. "My duty is finished, Arthur," she said, her voice so quiet it was almost a whisper, yet it carried the weight of a mountain. "I have given you my life, and tonight I gave you back hers. The debt is paid." Arthur's lip curled, but for the first time, a flicker of something like fear touched his eyes. He didn't answer. He couldn't. The morning after the storm, the Winthrop estate woke to a world buried in white, but inside a different kind of frost had set in. Hannah returned from the hospital in the gray light of dawn, her movements fluid and mechanical. She did not scream. She did not weep. She simply moved. When Arthur attempted to bark an order about his morning tea, Hannah prepared it in perfect silence, set it before him without a glance, and walked away. She had entered a state of absolute, unbreakable silence. It wasn't the silence of a victim, but the silence of a fortress. She continued her chores, scrubbing the salt from the floor, tending to the drafty windows, and preparing the flavorless meals Arthur demanded. But she spoke not a single word to the inhabitants of the house. The silence was so profound that it began to feel like an added weight to the old Boston air, making the halls feel colder and more hollow than the winter outside. Her only companion in this self-imposed exile was Bear. Bear was a senior golden retriever with cloudy eyes and fur the color of toasted oats. He had been a gift from Henry in the early golden years of their marriage, intended to be a guardian of their future home. Now he was a silent witness to its decay. While the humans in the house spoke over her or through her, Bear was the only one who truly looked at her. He followed Hannah from room to room, his tail giving a single heavy thud against the floor whenever she paused. Hannah spent her few moments of peace sitting on the cold kitchen floor, her face buried in Bear's neck. She didn't have to explain her exhaustion to him. He felt it in the tremor of her hands. He understood the language of tears that never fell, offering a soul connection that transcended the biting words of the Winthrop men. To the world, Hannah was a ghost, but to Bear, she was the sun around which his waning world turned. Henry, for the first time in a decade, began to feel the air thinning. For years, he had treated Hannah's presence like the foundation of a house, something invisible and taken for granted, something that simply held everything up while he admired the view from the windows. But as the days of silence stretched on, the foundation began to crack. He found himself lingering in the hallways, hoping to catch the sound of her humming or even the sharp tone of a complaint. Anything was better than this vacuum. He watched her from the shadows of his studio. He saw her tending to the garden beneath the snow, her back straight and her face a mask of stone. He realized with a creeping sense of horror that the woman who had once looked at him with starlit eyes was now looking right through him as if he were a pane of glass. Her absence, despite her physical presence, began to haunt him. He realized that Hannah wasn't just his wife. She was the very breath of the house, and without her voice, the estate was just a pile of cold bricks. As the week progressed, the tension reached a breaking point. Arthur, frustrated by the lack of a verbal target for his barbs, grew more erratic. He smashed a saucer when his toast was 10 minutes late, but Hannah merely swept up the shards with a terrifying calm, never acknowledging his presence. One evening, Henry intercepted her in the narrow corridor leading to the pantry. The dim yellow light of the hallway cast long, wavering shadows. He looked disheveled, his eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep and the weight of a guilty conscience. "Hannah, please," he whispered, reaching out to touch her arm. She stepped back, her movement so precise and cold that he pulled his hand away as if burned. "I'm sorry about the hospital. I'm sorry about everything. I was selfish. I was chasing something that wasn't there while I had everything right here. Just say something. Scream at me. Tell me you hate me. Just don't do this." He was desperate, a man drowning in a sea of his own making, begging for a single word to use as a life raft. He had prepared a long, poetic apology, the kind of words he used to write in his letters, hoping to mend the decade of neglect with a few minutes of eloquence. Hannah looked at him. Her eyes were not angry, they were empty. It was the look of a person who had traveled 1,000 miles and found nothing at the end of the road. She didn't open her lips. Instead, she reached into the pocket of her apron and pulled out a small, folded piece of white paper. She pressed it into his palm and walked past him, her footsteps light and final on the hardwood. Henry's hands shook as he unfolded the note. The handwriting was neat, the ink dark and unwavering. "I have no words left to give," the note read. "I used them all up on prayers you didn't hear and pleas you didn't answer. You asked for my heart, but you only wanted a servant. I have nothing more to say, for my heart has finally run dry." Henry slid down the wall, the paper fluttering to the floor. The silence of the house rushed in to fill the space where her voice should have been, heavy and cold as a tombstone. The grand decaying clock in the foyer struck midnight, its chime sounding more like a funeral bell than a marker of time. For decades, the Winthrop name had been protected by a fortress of lawyers and the sheer momentum of past prestige. But by January, the walls began to crumble. The past, long buried under layers of Bostonian reserve and sterling silver, had finally come to collect its debt. The news arrived not with a bang, but with a certified letter and a knock from a man in a sharp charcoal suit. Agent Marcus Vance, a stern investigator from the state's Financial Crimes Division, a man with eyes like flint and a soul that seemed made of legal statutes, delivered the blow. Arthur's final holding, a legacy investment firm that had been the last vein of life for the family's vanity, was under official investigation for decades of misappropriation and tax evasion. Panic swept through the Winthrop estate like a virus. The nobility that Arthur so cherished was stripped bare in a matter of days. Arthur sat in his mahogany-paneled study, his face the color of wet ash, staring at a telephone that no longer brought good news. His hawk-like nose seemed to sharpen as his world narrowed. The aristocratic masks had fallen, and in their place were the terrified faces of people who had never learned how to survive without a pedestal. Beatrice and Clara arrived from New York, not to offer comfort, but to protect their own interests. The parlor, once a place of stiff tea parties, became a battlefield of hushed, frantic arguments. "I can't be tied to this, Father," Beatrice hissed, her designer coat still draped over her shoulders like armor. "My gallery's reputation is built on provenance. If the Winthrop name is dragged through a fraud investigation, I lose everything." "We have our own mortgages to think about," Clara added, pacing the frayed Persian rug. "We can't just throw money into a sinking ship. Henry, you're the one who lives here. Why haven't you managed the estate better? Henry sat on the edge of a velvet chair, looking smaller than he ever had. His architectural sketches were scattered on the floor, stepped on by his sister's heels. He looked toward the kitchen door, hoping for a silent anchor, but Hannah remained in her self-imposed exile of silence. From the periphery of the chaos, Hannah observed it all. She saw the girls who had sent hollow cards now bickering over who would be forced to pay for the heating bill. She saw the way they looked at the antique furniture, not with love but with the eyes of liquidators. The Grand Winthrop legacy was being torn apart by its own heirs. Hannah's silence had become a mirror. By refusing to speak, she forced them to hear the ugliness of their own voices. While they fought, she quietly began the process of her own departure. In the small room off the kitchen, she began to pack a single, modest suitcase. She didn't take the silver. She didn't take the heavy linens. She packed her few books, her sturdy clothes, in the small wooden box that held her mother's hand-carved thimble. She felt a strange, mythic lightness. For 10 years, she had been the glue holding these broken pieces together. Now that she had let go, she watched the pieces scatter in the wind. She realized that the glory Arthur spoke of was merely a ghost, and the only real thing in this house was the soot on the walls and the love she had wasted on people who saw her as an appliance. One evening, the house grew terrifyingly quiet. The sisters had retreated to a hotel, unable to bear the cold of a house with a locked thermostat. Henry had wandered out into the snow, looking for a bar that would still serve him on credit. Arthur remained in his study, the shadow of a man who had outlived his own lies. He emerged from the study, leaning heavily on his cane, his movements jerky and desperate. He found Hannah in the kitchen, wrapping a loaf of bread in cloth. He didn't look like a patriarch anymore. He looked like a beggar. "Hannah," he whispered, his voice cracking. "The lawyers. They say there is a way to forestall the seizure of the house. A bond. It's not a huge amount, but the accounts are frozen." Hannah didn't look up from her bread. "I know about your savings," Arthur continued, his eyes darting to the floor. "The money your grandmother left you, the money you've kept in that separate account all these it's enough to buy us time, to save the estate, to save our name." Hannah paused. She thought of that small sum, the modest inheritance she had guarded as her only tether to a life of her own. It was her ticket to Providence. It was her freedom. Arthur stepped closer, his hand trembling as he reached toward her. "Think of Eleanor. Think of Henry. If we lose the house, where will we go? You are a Winthrop, Hannah. This is your legacy, too. Save us." Hannah finally turned to face him. The silence she had maintained for weeks didn't break. It focused. She looked at the man who had called her clumsy, who had dismissed her life-saving efforts as basic duty, and who now asked her to bleed her last drop of hope to save his dented silver. "No," she said. The word was a strike of flint against stone. Arthur recoiled as if she had struck him. "No? You would let us drown? Out of spite?" "It is not spite, Arthur," Hannah said, her voice lyrical and grounded. "It is the truth. For 10 years I have been the sacrifice you burned to keep this house warm. I have given you my youth, my health, and my words. You ask me to use my grandmother's legacy to cover the tracks of your own greed?" "It's for the family," Arthur barked, a ghost of his old authority flickering. "Justice is not a trade, Arthur," Hannah replied, picking up her suitcase from the corner of the room. "Justice is not using the sacrifice of the innocent to hide the sins of the guilty. You built this house on the idea that you were better than the world. Now the world is asking you to prove it. I am no longer your shield." She walked past him, her boots clicking firmly on the linoleum. Arthur stood in the center of the kitchen, surrounded by the smell of old grease and the chilling realization that the person he had treated as a shadow was the only one who had truly been keeping the light on. Hannah walked out the back door into the crisp, biting night. Bear was waiting by the porch, his tail giving a slow, knowing wag. She didn't look back at the fog-shrouded windows of the Winthrop estate. She looked toward the south, toward the quieter, tree-lined streets of Providence, where a different life was waiting to be baked from scratch. Providence greeted Hannah not with the cold, judgmental stone of Boston, but with the scent of salt air and the gentle swaying of ancient elms. The city felt like a soft exhale. She settled into a small studio apartment, on a street lined with clapboard houses painted in shades of sage and butter yellow. It was a modest space, but it was hers. There were no dented silver platters here, no moth-eaten tapestries of a dying lineage. Only the sunlight dancing on the hardwood floors and the quiet companionship of Bear, who seemed to have shed years from his tired joints the moment they crossed the Rhode Island border. Hannah found work at the Hearth and Whisk, a small artisanal bakery tucked into a cobblestone alleyway. The owner, Silas Thorne, a man with flour-dusted forearms, a salt and pepper beard, and a laugh that rumbled like a wood-fired oven, didn't care about the Winthrop name. He only cared that Hannah's hands knew the rhythm of the dough, and that her eyes lit up when the scent of cinnamon and yeast filled the morning air. Silas was a man of few words but immense kindness. He observed the way Hannah worked, with a precision born of years of survival, but a grace that was starting to bloom anew. "You bake like someone who's been hungry for a long time, Hannah," he said one morning as they pulled golden loaves of sourdough from the oven. "Not for food, but for something else. Glad you're finding it here." In Providence, Hannah was no longer a ghost or a servant. She was the woman who made the best lavender honey shortbread in the East Side. She was the woman who smiled at the students from the nearby design school. She was becoming a version of herself that had been buried under a decade of Bostonian soot. Back in Boston, the Winthrop estate was no longer a fortress. It was a tomb. With the departure of Hannah, the invisible threads that held the house together snapped. The dust didn't just settle, it conquered. Henry stood in the middle of the kitchen, staring at a sink full of crusty dishes and a layer of grime on the counters that he had never realized was there. For the first time in 10 years, Henry had to face the mundane brutality of his own existence. He had to learn how to operate the temperamental boiler that Hannah had coaxed into life every morning. He had to learn how to wash his father's silk shirts without ruining them, a task he failed at miserably, leaving Arthur to roar in a house that was growing colder by the day. Henry spent his days wandering the hollow rooms, picking up the ruins that Hannah had silently managed. He found a drawer full of unpaid bills she had organized, a list of Eleanor's medications he didn't know how to pronounce, and a notebook where she had tracked every leak in the roof. The weight of his own ignorance crushed him. He realized that Hannah hadn't just been his wife. She had been his buffer against reality. He had lived in a dream of architectural sketches and hollow networking, while she had lived in the trenches of his family's decay. He looked at the empty chair where she used to sit, and for the first time, he didn't see a servant he had lost. He saw a woman he had systematically dismantled. "She's gone, Henry," Eleanor whispered from her chair one afternoon. She was pale, but since the hospital, her mind seemed sharper, as if the shock had cleared the fog. "And you didn't even notice the color of her eyes when she left, did you?" Henry sank to the floor, his head in his hands. "I didn't know, Mother. I didn't know it was this much." "You chose not to know," Eleanor replied, her voice a soft, stinging truth. "It was easier to let her drown so you could keep your hands dry." Henry couldn't bear the silence of the house anymore. It was a silence he had helped create, but now it was a predator, devouring his sanity. Late one Friday, driven by a desperation he couldn't name, he looked at Bear's empty leash hanging by the door, but Bear wasn't there. Then he remembered. Hannah had taken the dog. He grabbed his coat and drove south. He didn't have an address. He didn't have a plan. He only knew that Providence was where her heart had always turned. He spent 2 days walking the streets of the city, looking for a chestnut-haired woman and a golden dog. He felt like a specter haunting a world he no longer belonged to. His shoes were scuffed, his coat unpressed. The Winthrop polish was finally wearing off, revealing the hollow man beneath. On Sunday morning, near the historic district, Henry saw a flash of gold near a flower stall. It was Bear. The old dog was sitting patiently by a cobblestone alley, his tail wagging with a slow, rhythmic joy. Bear looked up, his cloudy eyes focusing on Henry for a brief moment, but he didn't bark. Instead, he stood up and began to walk down the alley with a strange, purposeful gait. "Bear," Henry whispered, his heart leaping into his throat. "Bear, wait." The dog led him toward a storefront with a large glass window and a sign that read, "The Hearth and Whisk." The air in the alley was intoxicating, the scent of toasted butter, sugar, and warm bread. Henry slowed down as he approached the window, his breath hitching. Inside, the bakery was bathed in the soft, golden light of the morning sun. There behind the counter stood Hannah. She was wearing a simple denim apron, her sleeves rolled up to her elbows, her forearms dusted with white flour. She was talking to an elderly woman holding a bag of croissants. And as she spoke, Hannah threw her head back and laughed. It wasn't a quiet, polite laugh. It was a radiant, mythic sound that seemed to fill the room and spill out into the street. Her eyes were bright, her skin glowing with the heat of the ovens and the light of her own newfound strength. She looked like a painting of a goddess of the harvest, grounded, powerful, and utterly free. Henry froze. He stayed in the shadows of the alley, hidden by a stack of flour sacks. He watched the woman he had called clumsy and incompetent move with a grace that surpassed anything he had ever drafted on vellum. He realized with a soul-searing clarity that he hadn't just lost a wife. He had lost the light of his world because he was too busy admiring his own shadow. The new Koi he saw through the glass was the one he had spent a decade extinguishing in Boston. Now it was burning bright in Providence, and he was nothing more than a ghost watching the sun. The winter in Providence began to soften, the harsh Boston ice giving way to a restless, salty spring. Henry did not approach the bakery that first day. He stayed in a nearby motel, a modest place that smelled of industrial lemon and faded carpets, a far cry from the high thread count sheets of the Winthrop estate. He spent hours watching his reflection in the cracked vanity mirror, seeing a man who had finally run out of excuses. He realized that the miracle he needed wasn't for Hannah to return, but for himself to finally wake up. He began small. He showed up at the back door of the Hearth and Whisk at 5 in the morning, dressed in the sturdy work clothes he had purchased at a local thrift store. Silas Thorne greeted him with a knowing, heavy-lidded gaze, but didn't ask questions. Silas simply handed him a crate of heavy flour sacks. "If you're here to talk, go home," Silas rumbled. "If you're jai to work, the delivery van needs loading." Henry worked. For the first time in his life, he let his hands speak for his heart. He didn't beg Hannah for a conversation. He didn't craft poetic apologies. Instead, he became the silent shadow of her success. He loaded the van, he scrubbed the flour-dusted floors, and he took over the morning delivery route to the local cafes. He saw Hannah every day, but he kept his distance, offering only a respectful nod. He was learning the most difficult lesson of his life: how to be present without being the center of attention. He began to listen. He listened to the way Hannah talked to the customers, her voice no longer a weary whisper, but a vibrant melody. He listened to the concerns of the local shopkeepers, people like Elias Vance, a blind clockmaker who lived above the bakery. Elias was a man of 80 with a face like a topographical map and ears that could hear a heartbeat from across the room. "You're the one from the north, aren't you?" Elias asked Henry one afternoon as they sat on the bakery's back steps. "The one with the heavy footsteps and the loud guilt?" "I'm trying to help," Henry replied, his voice low. "Help isn't just doing chores, boy," Elias said, tapping his cane. "It's hearing the notes between the words. Your wife, she's playing a new song now. If you want to be in the band, you have to learn the rhythm of her life, not force her back into yours." While Henry was finding his footing in Providence, a different kind of transformation was occurring in the hollowed-out shell of the Boston estate. Arthur Winthrop was alone. The lawyers had finished their work, the silver was being cataloged for auction, and the tall, narrow house was being prepared for seizure. Beatrice and Clara had retreated to their lives in New York, their visits ceasing the moment the well of inheritance ran dry. Left with nothing but the echoes of his own arrogance, Arthur began to drift through the rooms. He found himself in the workshop in the basement, a place he hadn't visited in 40 years. Beneath the dust and cobwebs sat an old workbench. Before Arthur was a gentleman, before the Winthrop name was a brand of empty prestige, he had been a man who worked with wood. He had been a carpenter's apprentice, a man who understood the grain of oak and the scent of sawdust. One evening, by the light of a single flickering bulb, Arthur sat down at the bench. He didn't reach for a silver spoon. He reached for a pencil and a scrap of paper. With trembling hands, he began to write. A week later, a letter arrived at the bakery in Providence. Hannah opened it with a mix of dread and curiosity. The handwriting was not the sharp, demanding script of the Arthur she knew, but a shaky, humble crawl. "Hannah," the letter began, "I found an old cedar box today. I made it when I was 20, long before I convinced myself that I was better than the trees it came from. I remember the blisters on my hands and the pride I felt in a joint that fit perfectly. Somewhere along the way, I forgot that the only thing of value I ever made was with my own labor. I looked at you for 10 years and saw a servant because I had forgotten that I was once a servant too, to my craft, to the truth. I killed this family with my pride. I cannot ask for your money or your return. I only ask that you remember the man I was before the mirrors lied to me. I am sorry for the smoke I forced you to live in. Hannah sat in the quiet of the bakery, the scent of lavender and yeast surrounding her. She looked at the letter, and for the first time in a decade, she felt a flicker of empathy for the man who had nearly broken her. The myth of the Winthrops had died, and in its place, a human being was trying to crawl out of the wreckage. The transformation hook of their lives was not a sudden burst of light, but a slow, persistent thaw. Henry continued his silent service, helping Hannah not because he wanted a reward, but because it was the right thing to do. He grew leaner, his face weathered by the Rhode Island sun, his architectural dreams replaced by the immediate reality of a life built on service. One Sunday after the bakery had closed and the streets of Providence were bathed in the soft gold of the setting sun, Henry was cleaning the display cases. Hannah came out from the back, her apron dusted with flour, Bear trooping along behind her. "The lake is calm today," she said. It was the first time she had initiated a conversation that wasn't about work. Henry stopped his scrubbing, his heart hammering against his ribs. "Is it? If you believe that God still performs miracles, this story will restore your faith." She looked at him, not with the empty eyes of the Boston house, but with a searching, reflective gaze. Not the kind of miracle that parts the sea, but the kind that mends a heart that was shattered into 1,000 pieces. She reached out and took the rag from his hand. "Let's walk, Henry, just once around the lake. No talk of the past, no talk of the house, just the air and the light." They walked toward Roger Williams Park, the trees beginning to bud with the promise of spring. Bear trotted between them, a golden bridge in the fading light. As they moved along the water's edge, the silence between them changed. It was no longer the heavy, suffocating silence of Boston, nor the defensive silence of the bakery. It was a new, fragile quiet, a space where two people could stand as equals, grounded in the reality of their own mistakes and the hope of a newfound strength. Henry didn't try to take her hand. He didn't try to fill the space with words. He simply walked beside her, listening to the rhythm of her footsteps on the gravel, marking the beginning of a journey that was no can lie about serving a legacy, but about building a life. The spring air in Providence had finally lost its bite, replaced by the sweet, heavy scent of blooming magnolias and the salt-kissed breeze of the Atlantic. The city felt alive, vibrating with a renewed energy that seemed to pulse in sync with Hannah's own heart. The Hearth and Whisk had become more than just a place of employment. It was the theater of her rebirth. On this particular Saturday, the bakery was closed to the public, but the ovens were humming. It was the day of the spring social, a small gathering Silas had encouraged Hannah to host for the friends and neighbors who had become her new family. Hannah moved through the space with a lightness that made her appear almost ethereal. She wore a dress the color of wild lavender, her hair falling in soft waves that caught the golden afternoon light. She was no longer the grease-stained steward of a decaying Boston estate. She was a woman whose presence commanded respect not through a name, but through the warmth she radiated. Silas Thorne stood by the large wooden prep table, now covered in white linen and laden with Hannah's signature bakes. Joining him was a new face in Hannah's circle, Mrs. Gable. Mrs. Gable was a plump, energetic woman in her late 60s who ran the community garden down the street. She had silver curls that defied gravity and a laugh that sounded like wind chimes. "You've done it, dear," Mrs. Gable said, patting Hannah's hand. "You've turned this little corner of the world into a sanctuary. It's not just the bread, it's the peace you've brought with you." "Thank you, Mrs. Gable," Hannah replied, her smile genuine and deep. "I think I finally realized that peace isn't something you find. It's something you bake into the life you choose for yourself." Henry was there too. He wasn't the man who hid behind architectural sketches of grand, empty libraries. He was helping Elias Vance navigate the crowded room, his touch gentle and attentive. Over the past few months, the Winthrop Polish had been replaced by a quiet, grounded strength. He had traded his vanity for a hammer and a flour scoop, and in doing so, he had found his soul. The bell above the door gave a soft jingle, and a hush fell over the room. Arthur Winthrop stepped inside. He didn't lean on a mahogany cane with the arrogance of a fallen king. He carried a simple walking stick he had carved himself from a piece of reclaimed cedar. He looked older, his face more lined, but his eyes were clear, stripped of the fog of hollow pride. He walked straight toward Hannah. The guest watched, sensing the mythic weight of the moment. Arthur stood before the woman he had once called incompetent and clumsy. He didn't look at the floor this time. He looked her in the eyes, his voice steady but thick with emotion. "Hannah," he said, loud enough for those nearby to hear, "I spent 40 years building a facade of silver and stone, and I nearly crushed the only real person I had under its weight. I was a man blinded by mirrors. I am here to say, before everyone who knows your worth, that I am deeply sorry. You were never our servant. You were our grace, and I was too small a man to see it." Hannah felt a final, lingering knot in her chest dissolve. Justice, she realized, wasn't just about seeing the wicked punished. It was about seeing the truth acknowledged. She didn't embrace him. The decade of smoke was too thick for that. But she gave him a slow, dignified nod of acceptance. It was enough. The debt was not just paid, it was forgiven. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, the party began to wind down. Arthur and Henry stayed to help clean, working side by side without the old hierarchies. There was a comfortable rhythm to their movements, a shared understanding that they were no longer Winthrops of the Boston estate, but men learning to be part of a family again. Later that night, as the rest of Providence slept, Hannah and Henry drove toward the coast. They stopped at a high point overlooking Narragansett Bay. The air was cool and smelled of the deep sea. They sat on the hood of the car, Bear resting his heavy head on Hannah's lap, his tail thumping a slow beat of contentment. "I sold the last of the sketches today," Henry said quietly. "Not the grand libraries. The small ones I did of the bakery. Silas wants to help me turn them into a real plan for an expansion, a community kitchen." Hannah looked at him. "A kitchen where people can learn to bake their own way out of the dark?" "Exactly," Henry smiled. "A place built on a real foundation." They watched in silence as the first sliver of dawn began to crack the horizon. The sky shifted from a deep, velvety indigo to a brilliant, burning orange. The light spilled over the water of the bay, turning the waves into liquid gold. It was a new day, a new city, and a life they were finally building as equals. Hannah leaned her head on Henry's shoulder. She wasn't the Dutrong, eldest daughter-in-law, Ganvak the Gioy, carrying the world anymore. She was Hannah. She was a baker, a friend, a woman who had walked through a 10-year storm and found the sunrise. If you believe that love and forgiveness are the most powerful medicines, please leave a message for women who are as resilient as Hannah. Your faith in their strength is the light that helps them find their way home. Hannah's journey teaches us that our worth is not defined by the roles others force upon us, nor is it measured by how much of ourselves we can sacrifice until we disappear. In our daily lives, it is easy to become a shadow in someone else's house, seasoning our days with the salt of silent tears. But true strength is not found in endless endurance. It is found in the courage to stand in the light of our own truth. We learn that justice and redemption begin the moment we stop being a shield for those who refuse to grow and start building a life on a foundation of self-respect. Remember, the hands that serve are just as holy as the hearts that lead, and you deserve to be loved for who you are, not just for what you do. If Hannah's story touched your heart today, please help us share this light with others. Like this video to show your support for every resilient soul out there, and share it with a friend who might need to hear that it is never too late for a new beginning. Comment below with your own thoughts or stories of strength, and subscribe to our channel to join our growing family. Your engagement helps us continue telling stories that matter. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for the miracles that happen in the quiet moments of our lives, the mending of broken hearts and the softening of hardened pride. We ask for your blessing upon every person watching this today. May you grant them the strength of Hannah to walk out of the smoke, the humility of Henry to learn the rhythm of service, and the peace of a new sunrise over the bay. Guide their steps, protect their homes, and let them know they are never truly alone in their struggles. If you believe that God still performs miracles and you welcome his blessing into your life today, please write Amen in the comments below.